Please be seated. There is a book that I've read a number of times by a lady named Susan Scott, and it was probably devised as one of these business books, but it has taken on a ever important role in nonprofits and churches. And the name of the book is Fierce Conversations. And the premise of the book is that careers, institutions, and relationships fail gradually, then suddenly, one conversation at a time. And the thing that one little buzz sentence misses is that a lot of the book is about that one conversation that never takes place, right? So, and in Paul's letter to the Romans this morning, I've always been caught by this passage because the way it begins, owe no one anything. Well, that doesn't sound like our Christian understandings of things. So where are we going with this? Except to love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. Both of these 2 points are very good primers for the gospel lesson today. Because in our gospel lesson, Jesus reminds us of the importance of Christian community. Speaking to his disciples, he lets them know that community is not something you do by yourself. You can't go out and practice it by yourself alone under a tree. Their life as Christians is a community affair. Something that happens when 2 or 3 are gathered together in Christ's name. We need one another. Not just for practical reasons, but for those spiritual needs that we all have in our lives. 2 heads are better than 1. We need each other because we can accomplish more together as a team. We need each other like brothers and sisters need each other. We are reminded that we belong to one family. When families are working right, they are God's way of teaching us important things, aren't they? Like how to share, and how to work together, and how to take care of one another. The healthy family has a way of smoothing over all those rough edges that we have. I think about, as an image, being in the basement with my grandfather as a young boy and going out into the farmland and bringing back all these little rough rocks. And he'd put them in this plastic tube and put it on that little machine, and we'd come back 6 weeks later and they were all nice and smooth. That's sort of like what families do for us. Because they remind us of how truly human we are. However, being in a family can also teach us another thing. It can teach us how to fight. And as the oldest child, and as my 2 sisters would say, probably not the nicest oldest child, I learned to fight by being silent. Not speaking to my parents, not speaking to my 2 sisters for long periods of time. And one night at dinner, I found a way to take silence to a whole new level. My mother was busy prepping the final parts of dinner, and my dad had just gotten home and probably hadn't had time to catch the aura in the air of Gary being whatever Gary was back then. And so I looked at my sister across the table and I squinted my eyes and I flared my nostrils And I started breathing very hard and very intentional. I think I looked like a crazed killer. And my sister, and you know, the amazing thing is that this worked because she got so upset. But she was so upset, but she couldn't describe what was happening to her. And so eventually it just got to her and she started crying and she started yelling and she said, "Daddy, tell Gary to stop breathing at me." And at that point, because it wasn't as nice as I just said it, and it really wasn't funny because the terror in her face touched me to the point that I leapt up and went around to her and put my arm around her and said, "I will not breathe at you anymore." That's what families teach us. They teach us how to forgive and to ask for forgiveness. Because even though in families we know how to fight, we know how to make up. Now, in some families, probably all families at some times in our lives, rules sometimes, at least it appears, become more important than people. Where the first rule is silence. And that is silence about anything that is unpleasant. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say it at all, right? If you have a problem with someone, keep it to yourself, because the harmony, or really the illusion of harmony, is the most important thing. More important than telling the truth, more important than your feelings, and more important, finally, than your own self. And Christ tells us today that that is just not the way Christian families work. When your brother sins against you, you must go and talk to them. And if that does not work, you must keep going back, taking other people if you have to the next time, doing everything in your power to get your brother or your sister back. I don't know if you've noticed, but in this passage this morning from Matthew, Jesus advises us two things that are contrary to our way of being. The first thing that Jesus does is that he puts the burden on the person who has been hurt, not on the person who has done the sinning. And then the second thing that Jesus does is that he cares less. In fact, he doesn't care at all about who is right or wrong. He cares about keeping the family together, right? Because the only thing worse than losing a brother or a sister is pretending that you didn't lose that brother or the sister. Because it's sort of like that wound that you leave untended. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, I don't know if any of you have read it, but he paints an image, a harrowing image of hell. And it's harrowing for me because, especially today, because it seems to be so much like what we are experiencing in our society today. Because he describes it, hell is like a vast gray city. And the city is inhabited only on its outer edges, with rows and rows of empty houses and empty streets in the middle. And they are empty because all the people who live there got mad at their neighbors, quarreled with them, and decided to move, and decided to leave. And they moved farther out, and then they quarreled with their neighbors there, and they moved out some more, so that the inner part of the city is totally empty. And Lewis goes on to say, that's how hell got so big. Empty in the center and inhabited only on the edges, because everyone in it chose distance instead of confrontation, reconciliation, conversation. Now, I know that confronting the person who has wronged us is often that which most of us would do our best to avoid. But in Christian community, we're called to go to them. We're called to sit down with them and talk to them about it. Because for us, there is something more important than being right or wrong. And that something is keeping the family together. For us, the real problem is not the brother or sister who sins against us, but our own fierce wish to defend ourselves against them, regardless of the cost. And when confronting others, the real question is, the real thing we have to ask ourselves is the relationship worth the risk? The only real reason to take Jesus' advice is to win back a relationship that is in danger of being lost. Our goal is reconciliation, not retribution, and that being right is less important than being in relationship. When someone crosses us, when we are called to be the first to reach out, even when we are the ones who have been hurt, even when God knows that we did not do anything wrong, even when everything in us, down to our inner core being, tells us to fight back, we must remember that we are called to be in community with one another, to act like the family that we are. For that is how we know God, and that is how God knows us. That is what we are called to do, to confront and make up, to forgive and seek forgiveness, to heal and to be healed, to throw a big block party smack in the middle of the deserted center of hell, and fill the place with such music and laughter, such merriment and mutual affection, that all of those far-flung residents on the outer edges come creeping in from those distant places to see what all the fuss, what all the light, what all the joy is about.